Let me introduce our problem first. So we are talking about legal statutes, which are like codified articles of law, which are enacted by legislatures of different countries. So you can see on the left, we are giving an example of newspaper cutouts where they're talking about different crimes that have taken place. And so you can see that there are mentions of section numbers or article numbers like 376 to 28A and 498A and so on, related to different crimes. So these are known as legal statutes. So more formally, each legal statute can be thought to have three components. The first being ID, like the section number or article number. The second is the short title, like the short description of the statute. And the third is the full description, which lists all the conditions and everything. And the task is, the input is usually the fact of a legal case or situation, which is a description of what actually happened that led to the case. So again, we can see that this is the description of a fact taken from an Indian court case document. And there's a lot of text, but as you can understand, this highlighted portion talks about an incident where some people were attacked by others using some weapons. And thus this statute, which is voluntarily causing hurt using dangerous weapons or means, so this statute is relevant for this case. Similarly, because of that attack, one of the persons has expired, so the statute regarding murder is also applicable. So the main need for solving this task is that firstly, LSI or statute identification is generally the first step in the judicial process of countries that follow some notion of a civil law system like India, China, and so on. Secondly, building any AI-based method for this, for the legal domain should be able to understand or interpret the legal statute. So based on any user query, these models should be able to return the statutes which are relevant for the situation. And thirdly, there are a lot of challenges which are particularly nuanced for this problem, like the text or the input is usually long and noisy, and there is often very little difference between the semantics of different statutes, so distinguishing can be a challenge. So we will talk about these in detail. So just briefly, most prior works in this field can be broadly divided into three categories. So first is those approaches that directly take only the facts and nothing else. So they take the facts and try to predict the statutes from there. The second group of work, they also try to include the text of the statute and a matching mechanism or some sort to do the same task. And finally, there are many approaches that involve other subtasks, legal subtasks, like charge identification, term of penalty, legal precedents, and so on. So in this particular work, we have not covered the third category. We are only focusing on the first two. So now we will mainly focus on the challenges of LSI and how different models try to overcome them. So the biggest three challenges we feel are, firstly, the confusing label semantics. Second is long and noisy fact text. And third is highly imbalanced distribution of statutes in most datasets. So let us elaborate a bit more. So this confusing statutes issue is that in many countries, there are multiple statutes related to the same crime, which are highly similar. And there might be small conditions which distinguish between them. For example, I've given two snippets of two sections related to kidnapping in the Indian Penal Code. And whereas there may be a lot of common words and text, the small highlighted portions are the only ones which help us distinguish between these two. So that is the first thing. And second thing is, just for kidnapping, we may have multiple statutes, 10 or 12 like these. So distinguishing between a pair is difficult enough as it is. When we have to distinguish between such a large set, the problem becomes even more tricky. So prior works have tried to propose some mechanisms which we call statute text handling mechanisms that actually try to create a statute-aware fact representation instead of the standard representation generated by transformer-based models or deep learning models. Secondly, as we saw in the like example before also, only certain portions of the facts are actually relevant for identifying certain statutes. And that is why the relevant portions in the fact often get separated with a lot of useless text, and that creates long-range dependencies, which is difficult for any deep learning model to handle. And finally, in terms of real labels, many prior works have devoted time to solving the real label issue, because the number of training examples for the rare classes become very low. Also, they often co-occur with frequent classes, and the model usually gets biased towards the frequent classes. So that becomes a challenge. So the objectives of our work is like these 4 steps. So we have tried to improve the LSI task using some modern approaches and combining different, different modules. And we tried to answer the 3 questions we have posed before, like what is the impact of confusing statutes, long text, and rare labels. So in our work, we have considered these 2 data sets. The first is based on the Indian legal system. So there we are having 100 statutes from the Indian Penal Code. So these are mostly related to the criminal law. And the second is this European Court of Human Rights dataset, where there are 10 statutes from the European Convention of Human Rights. On the left, you can see some examples of the statutes from each of these datasets. Secondly, both these datasets show a long tail distribution of statutes, which is common. So some are very frequent and most are quite rare. And also they show a similar distribution in terms of fact length, but the interesting thing is that if you notice the numbers on the graphs, only a small portion, or like less than 50% of cases actually fall within 512 tokens, which is like the limit for Bhatt type models. So we need specialized models for handling such long texts, basically. And we cannot truncate the information because then it will lead to much losses. So in our work, we have covered these 3 types of experiments. So the first is like encoder-only approaches. The second is the approaches that combine encoders with statute text handling. And thirdly, due to the proliferation of LLMs, we also tried out some basic text generation experiments. So this is the overall framework of different models that can perform multi-label text classification for this task. So only the fact encoding approaches, they work in the areas we are highlighting here. So you have the facts which go to an encoder that generates a representation, which we pass to a feed-forward network, and we get the probabilities of classes. So this is a simple, straightforward step. Now, as we discussed, some methods have introduced mechanisms to handle the statute text or incorporate the statute text as well when we are doing this classification. So the way this works is the same encoder is also used to encode the statute description. So you can see for every statute, we also get an embedding via this. And then all of them are passed together to this module, which we can represent as a function over here that takes the fact text and the text of all the statutes and generates a statute-aware fact representation, which is usually better than the general representation just coming from the facts. And then this is used for classification. So most of these statute text handling mechanisms, they were proposed in the papers which used quite old encoders like send-to-vec or RNN, CNN, such. So in our work, we have coupled the text handling module with latest state-of-the-art encoders to get better representations. So we have used two types of encoders. The first is a higher in-legal Bhatt, which is like a variant of higher Bhatt, where there is a Bhatt type model trained on legal documents that works on every sentence, and then a LSTM and attention module on top that generates the final representation. And the second is longformer, which is a transformer-based model designed for handling long text. Now, in terms of the text handling mechanisms, we have taken 3 particular models in our study. The first is BAF, which is using a bilinear attention. So it uses attention between the text of facts and all the statute texts to extract those portions of the fact text which can help attend to the statutes, and it combines them together. The second one, lecithin, it uses a citation network. So as we have also seen in prior presentations, the statutes belong to a hierarchical structure like a tree, and then the facts also combined together form a network. And this method uses a GNN over that entire network to make the predictions. And finally, we use this method called LADAN, which uses GNN over groups of confusing statutes. So it groups confusing statutes into communities and uses GNNs to obtain better representations for the confusing statutes. And each of these STMs we have combined with both Herbert and Longformer in our experiments, which we will see. And finally, in terms of text generation with LLMs, we have tried out a very simple zero-shot prompting setup where we just ask the model to identify the relevant sections of IPC or ECHR. Like the models we have used, they already have an idea about these statutes, that it is already in their knowledge. So we don't need to provide much extra information. We specify a particular output format and we give the facts, and the model generates the output. Okay, so I'll jump into the results because there's quite a lot to discuss here. So firstly, we have calculated everything in terms of macro F1 scores, and we have also done some significance testing. Now, because this is multi-label text classification, you may have more than one label for every example. We use this technique where we calculate the significance testing over each class, and then we compute what is the fraction or percentage of classes where the difference in performance is statistically significant. And that number we calculate to report the performance. So, yeah, so brief summary of the results. So here we have all the models. So ILB stands for hierarchical in-legal BERT, LF stands for Longformer, and then here we have the 3 STMs, and the B suffix stands for the Herbert encoder, and the L suffix stands for Longformer encoder. So we have coupled the STMs with both types of encoders over here, as well as text generation using the Llama 2 model. And as we can see, all models perform much better on the ECHR dataset, probably because it has a much easier target set of 10 statutes compared to 100 statutes for ILSI. Secondly, on its own, Longformer is a better encoder than hierarchical in-legal BERT, and the difference is quite pronounced on the ILSI dataset. Thirdly, simple zero-shot prompting is not as effective as these fine-tuned classification methods. As we can see, the gap in performance is huge between these methods and Llama 2. Also, we wanted to try out GPT 3.5, which is considered more powerful. And because it is not a free model, we could only run it on a subset, 100 documents each from each of the test sets. We ran the other models too on those test sets to make a fair comparison. And so these results are different from the ones we have seen before because these are on those 100 documents only. The main takeaway being that GPT 3.5 does better than the worst MLTC method, but it is still short of the best method. Whereas Llama 2 is not even able to beat the worst MLTC method. So there is some gap in performance over there. And to understand the effect of STMs or the statute text handling mechanisms, we see that when we add these mechanisms to the bare encoders, there is an increase in performance for the ILSI dataset. Whereas on the ECHR dataset, in some cases, we notice a slight drop in performance. That may be because the bare encoder itself is performing well enough and it gets saturated. But however, even if there is a drop in performance, it is not too large. And in some cases, we still obtain improvements in performance. Okay. Now we want to look at the 3 research questions we have posed. So the first being the effect of confusing statutes. Now, in standard classification or single label classification, we have a confusion matrix which can be defined, an n cross n matrix. But we cannot define such a matrix in a multi-level setup. And that is why we used a particular methodology to actually do this. The details are in the paper, could not present it here due to lack of time. However, the main idea is for a given pair of statutes, Li and Lj, we compute Cij, which is the number of times the model confuses Li for Lj. Or in other words, the true label was Li, whereas the model is predicting Lj, we count those number of times. Then what we do is we group the statutes into communities, or the statutes which are similar are in the same community. And then we try to find out the confusion inside the community, which is intra-community confusion, as well as the confusion outside the community. And the basic presumption is that the confusion inside should be much greater. And using these techniques, we finally get an overall measure Q and R. So Q stands for intra-community confusion and R for inter-community. All the details are in the paper. So we have only used this study for the ILSI dataset because there are 100 statutes to work with. We could not do it for ECHR because the statutes are fairly distinct over there. And so we have asked a legal expert to divide them into these communities, and we got 41, out of which 10 contain only one statute. So we do not consider those 10. We work with the rest 31 communities. So here is the brief results. So firstly, we'll talk a little bit about the R metric, which denotes inter-community confusion, or the confusion outside the community. Those values are fairly close to 1 by 99, which is same as random misclassification. So if you randomly misclassify a label into another one, you get a value of 1 by 99. So in other words, the R metric actually shows that when a model gets confused outside the community is mostly due to random reasons. Whereas you can see the Q values are much higher, which shows that there is a systemic confusion inside the community, which we do expect. And we see that when we add the STMs to the Bayer encoders, the confusion value actually reduces, which sort of goes towards proving the point that we should be using the STMs to reduce the confusion between the highly similar statutes. We also noticed similar trends when we picked up two random communities and saw the values, basically. Now, in terms of fact length, yes. So in terms of fact length, we have grouped the entire data set into 5 categories based on, so left to right, increasing order of fact length. We see for the ECHR data set, there is no particular trend and there is a lot of fluctuations. Whereas for the ILSI data set, we notice that the performance of each model remains fairly similar across all fact lengths. In other words, this parameter does not have much effect. Now, in terms of label frequency, there is an obvious dip in performance for the rarer labels on the right compared to the more frequent labels on the left. And models like LADAN help to improve performance over the rare labels. Similarly, for the ILSI dataset as well, we notice the same trends. Finally, we also considered some explainability experiments where there were some documents that were annotated by legal experts with the rationales or the important sentences that guide statute prediction. And the main insights are that the long-former model is more explainable than ILB, and adding BAF and lecithin actually reduces the explainability value, whereas LADAN actually improves it. So the details again are in the paper. So finally, the main takeaways is we achieved new state-of-the-art results for the ILSI dataset, and also we found that LADAN and lecithin coupled with long-former is quite powerful across both datasets. In terms of answering the research questions, so most models indeed get confused between those statutes which experts also consider to be confusing. And adding STMs to Bayer encoders can actually help reduce the confusion. In terms of long text, we did not observe any trends. And in terms of rare labels, again, all models show lesser performance on the rarer labels, but adding STMs like LADAN can help in that case. And finally, in terms of future work, we definitely want to try out supervised fine-tuning of LLMs because we think that the LLMs still can perform much better than the values we have seen. And we are also trying to look at pipeline-based approaches where we first use LLMs to simplify the input text using different techniques that will reduce the noise and the long-range dependencies. And then we will use these state-of-the-art models on the short-end text to possibly get even better performance. So thank you, and all our data and everything is hosted here.